Hello and welcome. Today I want to discuss what's called Sati's mistake. It's a mistake that an early monastic, an early monk made in the Buddha's presence that highlights one of the most important aspects of the early Buddhist Dharma. If you're new to this channel, by the way, and interested in living a wiser and a kinder and a calmer life, consider subscribing to this channel and click the bell down below if you want to receive notifications when I come out with new videos. So, Sati's mistake. One of the, I think, most incisive kinds of early suttas are the early suttas in which the Buddha reprimands a monk for wrong view. There aren't many of them, but there are a few, and they're all basically they're some of the suttas that are the most, incisive, because they really do get at fundamental aspects of early Buddhism, and we might say aspects that are easy to misunderstand and that have been misunderstood over the centuries after. Because, the fact that Sati made this mistake is, I think, indicative of the fact that many of us are inclined to make the same mistake in Sati's place. So, basically what happened is Sati is called the fisherman's son. He's the son of a fisherman. Not that it really matters, but in any event. And he has been expressing a view of his to other monks. And the other monks tell Sati that this view of his is mistaken. And his view is, as I understand the Buddha's teachings, it is this very same consciousness that roams and transmigrates, not another. And so the other monks tell him, well, I don't think that's correct. I don't think the Buddha wants to say that. But he holds, we might say stubbornly, that's generally the way it would be expressed, to his viewpoint. And eventually it gets to the Buddha's ear, and the Buddha asks Sati to come and talk with him. And so Sati expresses the viewpoint in the Buddha's presence. And the Buddha asks Sati a very pointed question, which is, what is that consciousness you're talking about? And Sati responds, it is he who speaks and feels and experiences the results of good and bad deeds in all the different realms. That is to say that this consciousness that Sati is talking about is the subject of karmic action. It's what produces karmic action, and it's what feels the results of karmic retribution, either good or bad. So it's the same consciousness. It's literally the same over time. It's unchanging. That would be Sati's view. And the Buddha responds to Sati by saying, foolish man, who on earth have you ever known me to teach in that way? Haven't I said in many ways that consciousness is dependently originated, since consciousness does not arise without a cause? So the Buddha is saying here that consciousness does not arise without a cause. It's dependently originated. Now that's quite a mouthful of an expression, and we'll try to unpack that in a little bit. But first, before we get there, I think it's very instructive to consider where Sati might have gotten his idea from. Because it seems as though Sati's idea didn't arise out of nowhere, but rather that it arose out of a particular historical, cultural condition. In other words, a place, an idea that was around in the Buddha's own day. Sati seems to have absorbed the view that the consciousness or the self is unborn or unproduced and therefore immortal. That same consciousness, again, proceeds from life to life, unborn, immortal, never dying. That, in fact, is the view held both by the Jains and the Vedic Brahmins, who are expressed in the Upanishads anyway, the later texts that were around in the Buddha's lifetime. The early Upanishads were around in the Buddha's lifetime. And in both of these rival schools of Buddhism, it was held that the self was just this kind of thing. It was unborn, it was undying, it was immortal, it would continue forever. And one of the greatest Pali scholars of recent years, K.R. Norman, has found a potential root of Sati's mistake in what's called the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. The Brihadaranyaka Upanishad is a text that was composed perhaps 2 or 3 centuries before the Buddha's lifetime. It seems as though the Buddha probably would have known about it, and indeed that he was probably reacting to it in many of his Dharma talks, or at least reacting to it in whatever stage it was at the time that he was alive. And there's a particular passage in this that seems to indicate something like Sati's view in a way that Sati might have held it. Now, I'm going to be discussing a particular translation of the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad by Patrick Olivelle, which is perhaps the best contemporary translation we have of it. The issue here, however, is that the word consciousness that we're discussing here, this consciousness that Sati is so interested in, that's an English word, obviously. The Sanskrit word, Sanskrit being the language in which the Upanishad was written or composed, the Sanskrit word for that is vijnana. And Patrick Olivelle usually translates that word with a different English word, and so we have to sort of read around his translation, and I'll try to make it as clear as I can when I talk about this. So in any event, what it says in the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad is, he sees but he can't be seen. He hears but he can't be heard. He thinks but he can't be thought of. He perceives, that is vijnana, he is conscious of, but he can't be perceived. In other words, things can't be conscious of him. It is this self of yours who is the inner controller, the immortal. So what we see in this passage is that the self is identified with vijnana, which is another is the word that we translate consciousness. That it's the inner controller, that it's immortal, that it never dies, that it was never born, that it controls all aspects of who we are. And this may remind some of us, if we're familiar with the Buddha's second sermon, of what the Buddha had to say there. Now, I'm not going to go into that in huge detail here, but in the Buddha's supposed and traditionally understood to be his second sermon, the Buddha discussed the idea of non-self. And how he did that in that sermon, which is supposedly the first time he ever discussed this topic, was to say that we did not have any perfect control over any aspect of ourselves or the world. In other words, the self is made up of 5 aggregates. I won't go into those, but different parts of the body and mind, basically. He splits the body and mind up into 5 different parts. Over none of those parts do we have perfect control. In particular, we don't have control over our consciousness, because consciousness does one thing and another no matter what we want it to do. We have some control, but not perfect control, and that's the point, is that there's no aspect of reality over which we have perfect control. Here the Upanishad is saying, the true self is that inner controller, and the Buddha is saying there isn't such an inner controller. So I think, again, we're seeing the Buddha responding to an idea from the early Upanishad here, one that Sati himself probably holds. And a second citation from the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, I think, makes Sati's point even clearer. There it says, "This immense unborn self is none other than the one consisting of perception, or vijnana, consciousness, here among the vital functions. There, in that space within the heart, he lies, the controller of all, the lord of all, the ruler of all. About this self, one can only say, not. He is ungraspable, for he cannot be grasped. He is undecaying, for he is not subject to decay." So in this pre-Buddhist Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, we have this idea of the self as a kind of an unborn and undecaying consciousness that proceeds through lifetimes, that is immortal, that is the controller of all that we are. And what we're going to find in early Buddhism is that the Buddha's own Dharma, the Buddha's own understanding of the self and the world, is in radical contradistinction to this concept from the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. The Buddha feels that there isn't such a thing as a permanent self. There isn't such a thing as something that's in perfect control, that is the internal controller of everything. And in particular, that there isn't such a thing as this consciousness that is unchanging, or that is undying and undecaying and unborn. Indeed, for the Buddha, consciousness is being born and decaying all the time. The Buddha's view is that there isn't really a single thing called consciousness. Instead, consciousness comes in 6 flavors. Each flavor of it depends upon its associated sense organ and the part of the world that makes contact with that sense organ. So, for example, the Buddha says that dependent upon the eye and forms or sights, there arises eye consciousness. So, in other words, when we see a form, when a form makes contact with our eye, something important enters our visual field, we might say there's a contact there, eye consciousness arises. Similarly, when a loud noise, when a noise interacts with our ear consciousness arises. And the same with taste and smell and touch and ideas with the mind. When ideas arise, make contact with the mind, a mental consciousness arises. And so these kinds of consciousness, each one is its own flavor, and each one is always in a process of being born through its associated perceptual organ, and then decaying when the perception ceases or another perception takes its place. And the Buddha goes on to analogize this in terms of fire and their fuel. So he says, just as grass produces a grass fire when it's given, let's say, a spark. So when you give a spark to grass, there's a grass fire. And rubbish creates a rubbish fire, and wood creates a wood fire. We might say hardwood creates a hardwood fire, and softwood creates a softwood fire, and so on and so forth. So it is that each form of our senses, each one of our senses, creates its own form of consciousness. They aren't the same. They're similar in certain respects, but each one is different, and each one is interchangeable or interchanges with the others. They're always being dying and being reborn. Nothing is ever permanent. So these kinds of consciousness aren't immortal. They aren't undying. They aren't undecaying. Indeed, they are dying and decaying all the time and being replaced all the time. And so they can't ground who we are in the way that the Upanishads claim, or this Brihadaranyaka Upanishad claims, because it's always going away. It's always dying and being replaced. And for that reason, the Buddha reprimands Sāti, the fisherman's son, because there isn't such a thing, a unified thing as consciousness that goes on from moment to moment, hour to hour, year to year, or even lifetime to lifetime in a traditional understanding, to ground who we are. Nothing does that. There is no thing that continues and persists in that respect, according to the Buddha. Now, it's also important to say that over the years and centuries and millennia of Buddhism, other ideas have taken the place of this consciousness in the Buddha Dharma as a potential ground of our continuation. And one of these ideas springs out of the idea, or the concept of the luminous mind, which we find mention of in the early texts. And I did an earlier video on that topic, and I'll put a link to it up here on the screen if you haven't seen it. If you're getting something out of these videos of mine, consider taking a look over at my Patreon page. It's linked down below, and see if you want to help out the channel. Thanks so much, and we'll catch you on the next one. Meanwhile, all of you, be well.